Hello, everyone. Hi to everyone who's just arriving. We're going to start the webinar in just a minute or two and give people a little bit more time to shuffle in. Hi again to everyone who's arriving. We're going to start the webinar in just a minute. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to a conversation with Katharine DeLamater and Tatiana Ginsburg. For those of you who are new to Dieu Donné, Dieu Donné is a leading nonprofit cultural institution dedicated to serving established and emerging artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand papermaking. Today, Katharine DeLamater, our 2020 and 2021 West Bayview Fellow, and Tatiana Ginsburg, our Director of Artistic Projects, will reflect on DeLamater's fellowship and the body of work she created in the studios over the last year. A few technical notes. This talk will last about 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions at the end. If you have any questions, feel free to navigate to the bottom of your Zoom window. You can click the QA function and enter your question, and we'll answer all of those questions at the end of this session. The session will be recorded and made available on our website in about 2 weeks. And if you're interested in watching any of our previous webinars, just navigate to the Dieu Donné YouTube channel or the events page on our website to access video links. All our webinars going forward will have the option of live captioning, which you can access by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, then select Show Subtitles. All our recorded webinars will also have the option for captioning, which will likely be more accurate captioning. This is a small step in a direction towards making our programs more accessible, which will be an ongoing process for us. Now to give a quick introduction to both of our speakers. Katharine received her MFA in book arts from the University of Iowa Center for the Book after first learning about hand papermaking at Mount Holyoke College. She has interned at Pace Paper, Dieu Donné, and the Boston Paper Collective. Katharine has taught classes at the University of Iowa Center for the Book, Dieu Donné Paper Mill, the Morgan Conservatory, and Polka Press. Her artist books are held in the Special Collections Library at Kenyon College, the Bainbridge Museum of Art, and private collections. Katharine was the Dieu Donné West Bayview Fellow from 2020 to 2021, Iowa Arts Fellow from 2017 to 2018, and has received support to study at Penland School of Craft in 2015 and Haystack Mountain School of Craft in 2015. Her writing on authorship and collaboration was published by Hand Papermaking magazine in 2019. She lives and works in Brooklyn. Tatiana Ginsburg studied papermaking and book arts at the University of Iowa Center for the Book and received her MFA from the University of California, Santa Barbara. In between, she spent 2 years in Japan researching naturally dyed paper under a Fulbright grant. Returning to the US, she taught papermaking, printmaking, book arts, and drawing in universities for more than a decade. As co-director, or now as director of artistic projects and master collaborator at Dieu Donné, she works with other artists to make new work in handmade paper. She also edits the series Papermaker's Tears, essays on the art and craft of paper for the Legacy Press. Her own work combines traditional and contemporary methods of papermaking and is exhibited nationally and internationally. So, Tatiana, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Willa. Thank you all for coming today, and it's nice to have a good group of cohorts for all of us, and especially for Katharine. This is kind of a really special thing for us to be able to do. And for those of you who don't know anything about the West Bay View Fellowship, and some of you do, it's a really wonderful opportunity that we have to bring somebody who's serious about papermaking and really committed already to the field to come to Dieu Donné for 6 months and really work alongside us. So Katharine's going to talk a lot about the West Bay View Fellowship and what that means. But I'd like to thank Joan Hall, and the West Bay View Fellow would not be possible without her. And I know she's on the call today. So thank you, Joan, and thank you, Mark, for doing this and bringing her to us. The fellowship is now in its, this was its 3rd year, and we're excited to continue it in the fall with a new fellow who may also be on this call. Okay, so Katharine, why don't you start and we can continue.
Great, thank you, Tatiana, and thank you, Willa, and everybody at Dieu Donné and the West Bay View West Bay View Foundation for my fellowship. I'm really excited to share this space with everyone today. I wanted to start off talking about what I was doing right before coming to New York and Dieu Donné with my work in Iowa City at the University of Iowa, where I, like Willa mentioned, graduated with an MFA in book arts this past May. I was lucky enough to be able to complete my thesis work more or less before the COVID shutdowns. And I'm really grateful to have had that experience and the opportunity to continue to delve into some of the ideas that maybe weren't quite finished when I left Iowa City. I knew I wanted to go to the Center for the Book because of the long legacy of hand paper making led by Tim Barrett, among other visiting instructors over the years. And I had the opportunity to work for 2 years as one of Tim's research assistants out at the University of Iowa Oakdale papermaking facility. And so in that experience, I got to really refine production papermaking. And I know there are a number of people on the call today who might not know what that means. And there are many people who do. So I'm just going to clarify what I mean by that term. So the production papermaking we were doing at Oakdale was large quantities of paper for sale, or that had been ordered by book artists and bookbinders. So we were producing hundreds of sheets a day based on historical models of papermaking, working often in teams of 2 or 3. And so I really, in that time period, honed my sensibilities for efficiency with papermaking while not sacrificing the quality and the craft of paper. And in this slide to the right is my good friend Colleen Lawrence, who was also there with me. And I wanted to talk a little bit about also how I've always been attracted to hand paper making because of the community aspect of it, which really was maintained as I joined Dieu Donné as the West Bay View Fellow. You spend a lot of time with other people in the paper studio, whether you need help lifting something or you're working together, one person at the vat, one person cooching. And so that's always been really special to me. There are, of course, sometimes that I just want to sit and draw by myself, but oftentimes the Friday papermaking days at Oakdale were one of my favorite days of the week to kind of all come together. And during the summer of 2018, I actually was at Dieu Donné for a fellowship that was sponsored by the University of Iowa Graduate College, during which I took time to interview master paper makers and collaborators and artists in the kind of surrounding New York area, including Anne McEwen, Paul Wong, Ruth Lingen, Akemi Martin. In addition to Leslie Dill was also a big support for that project, because I really wanted to learn more about how artists and master craftspeople, master paper makers were working together, which has been a large part of Dieu Donné's mission since it was founded. These are some of my works in progress from my thesis work at Iowa. I always am taking pictures of my little piles that accumulate because I feel like they really sum up the way that my brain works, because it's a bit of an organized chaos that just make me happy, and they feel like hanging out with my little friends in the studio when I am alone. And I worked at Iowa combining handmade paper and letterpress printing, with the support of Tim and Sarah Langworthy, and really trying to figure out how to bring together the best of both of those universes. And I was doing production paper making for my own artwork. This is 9 different shades of pigmented abaca paper that were then letterpress printed using pressure prints and photopolymer prints to create an artist's book with text that I had written. And I was really focusing on how to get a handmade paper that was crisp and strong enough for all of these folds, while also really maintaining the beautiful coloration of abaca, and just enjoying. I often say that I make books because I want people to be able to feel the paper. I want people to have that sensation of what makes me so happy leafing through a pile of sheets of paper on my desk, or I'll find myself just rubbing paper between my fingers to calm myself down sometimes. So experimenting with that, trying to get the deepest black that I could, and also working in editions. So making multiples of these. This was an edition of 20. So there was a spirit of play, but also a spirit of this needs to be done several times over, and not compromising the quality. So that's a little preview for what maybe were some of the things that I was tackling during my fellowship with my artistic practice. I started working with cheesecloth and pressure printing from cheesecloth in this artist's book to add visual texture to my handmade paper beyond what was already there. And so that will kind of also come into my work at Dieu Donné. This project is titled 7 Observations, which it's kind of like my papermaker's book, meaning I loved the deckled edges of this paper. I loved being able to see the beautiful drape of the sheets. And I was having a meeting with Sarah Langworthy saying, well, I guess I'm probably just going to fold this up and pamphlet stitch it, and then it'll be a book. But what would happen when you fold that paper is you would lose that beautiful drape that's happening in the middle. So I worked with Julie Leonard to come up with a housing for it in which you could bind the book without folding the sheets or puncturing the sheets, which was a really fun way to reconsider how handmade paper could appear in artists' books. And these were abaca sheets that were pulp painted using pigmented short cotton fiber that was mixed with formation aid, which allows them to get this fluid atmospheric tone. And then I was in Brooklyn. And so those were two projects that I wanted to talk about specifically because they really informed how I had been thinking about my artwork and my making process for at least the 18 months prior to coming to Dieu Donné, if not even further than that. And so I was really excited to get back to the paper studio with kind of an open-ended sense of play with my work, and also kind of the decompression from graduate school. I really enjoyed graduate school, but then also figuring out how to have an artistic practice outside of that. So my first project at Dieu Donné, I got to start putting my production paper making skills to use, which Tatiana can talk a little bit about what Dieu Donné's relationship to this project was previous to my joining.
Yeah, this is a really fun project for us. Usually every year we would have a lot of people coming into the studio. This is Love Positive Women. And some of you may have participated in that. Usually we would have studios full of people for days on end making handmade paper valentines that go to women all over the world who are living with HIV so that they feel loved on Valentine's Day. So it's a really, really warm and very social event normally. And we always enjoy having all of these people come to our studio, but obviously this year with COVID, that was not a possibility. So together with Visual Aids, which organizes LPW with us every year, and the Fire Island residency, we came up with the idea of making handmade paper hearts that would then go to the artists who would decorate them and do whatever they wanted to do to turn them into real Valentines and make something special that could be sent out. So we were able to continue the project even though we couldn't do it in the way that we've been doing it. And so Katharine, fortunately, coming to us from Iowa and having made a lot of production paper, was really game for diving into this right away and just making, I mean, how many did we make, Katharine? You must have made hundreds and hundreds.
Hundreds and hundreds. Our goal was 500. And with my calculations, we definitely still have a number sitting at Dieu Donné that are, potentially ready for next year or what have you, but definitely hundreds. And that was fun because I was just after my move to New York and everything, I was so happy to just be able to have a setup in which I could just pull sheet after sheet after sheet. I timed it on my first day and announced to Amy very proudly that I could make 56 an hour, which I then very quickly had to pull back because at that rate I would have been done with the project in a single day. So we also started adding some pulp paint to them, which again, this is the linen pulp paint that Dieu Donné uses for a lot of the projects that has been pigmented and mixed with, in this case, it was water and methyl cellulose to allow it to move about the couched sheet of paper to just create some sort of color variation.
Well, like
on
the background texture, right? Sort of
Yeah.
a little bit of a ground. And that was also fun for you, right? Because it was a big release from doing things that were supposed to be really perfectly additioned.
Exactly. And so Tatiana kind of, I was sort of just staring at the hearts, kind of like, I'm supposed to add something more to these, but I'm a little frightened to. And so we talked about this helpful metaphor of sort of like adding sprinkles to cookies or something, where you want them the cookies need to get decorated. You want them to look beautiful, but you're kind of doing them tray by tray. And that kind of comes into play with some of the work that I ended up doing with my professional days, having some more fun with pulp paint and not thinking that I needed to have a matrix or a stencil. So that was really good, a good experience for me. And Christian, our intern, also helped pull many hundreds of these hearts. I will give credit where credit is due for all of that help. They were very fun to make. And here is a slide of a small portion of the decorated hearts that were decorated from artists that visual aids had contacted, as well as Dieu Donné staff and other artists in the community. I had the opportunity to be the point person for a collaboration, working on a series of unique works with artist Lakila Brown, who is a New York-based artist, originally from Detroit. And we worked on she had originally been working in sculptural reliefs with these door knocker earrings, and we were interested in creating some low relief paper works with them. And a seemingly simple endeavor turned into a rather complicated endeavor quickly, as all things with paper making often do, because as the collaborator, it became my responsibility to figure out the pressure at which to operate the press as to not crush all of these earrings. As Lakila said to me a number of times, these aren't too precious to me, but they are also in a limited quantity for me. So, trying to toe that line between experimentation, but also really respecting the confines of experimentation, meaning like I couldn't just go gung-ho and smash all of these earrings and think that there were just going to be more of them that appeared. And the other thing that was interesting about this project was, looks like one slide didn't make it, but as you can see in kind of the lower left-hand corner, it's white on white, which leaves very little room to hide any mistakes. And so these earrings, they're die cut and pressed together, and then water gets trapped in them, thus releasing rust onto the sheet. And so a really big compliment I received from Lakila was how much I changed her casting practice by figuring out a way to waterproof the earrings, which was a series of experiments to figure out what sort of varnish we could coat the earrings with that wouldn't flake off onto the sheet and also wouldn't be so thick that we lost the detail of the earrings. And so these will be a forthcoming project from Dieu Donné, and something that was really informative because I had done so much writing and thinking about collaboration to really be the person at the helm of it. That's a kind of rare and amazing opportunity that the fellowship definitely afforded me.
Well, and you were the perfect person to do that because you have spent so much time really thinking about collaboration, and you're the first of our West Bayview fellows who actually did that. So, that's really also kind of to you for being really ready for that process and really kind of able to jump into working directly with an artist, which, as we know, anybody who's watched any of these, it's a really sensitive thing. So that's really shows how prepared you are.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a really fun project, and Lakila and I worked really well together and just really hit a wonderful rhythm, which again is the being in a space, sharing those spaces with people, working quietly is just one of my favorite things. From there, a kind of background project that I continued to work on was sorting through Dieu Donné's stock paper archive. So when Dieu Donné was producing papers that one could order several sheets of for a project and keeping in stock. I've done a lot of work with archives and other work that I've done. And so this was really fascinating to me. And I also think it's really important to have organized in a way that people can use, use this information. For example, there's a clear shift from when Dieu Donné was using primarily rag to when most of the papers became linter-based papers. One of my favorite ones is this paper from 1977 called Falco, which is a combination of feathers, wool, cotton rag, and linters, which is just it was like one of the very experimental papers. But then from there, I organized it so that these could be sent off in folders to institutions who were requesting Dieu Donné samples for their conservation labs, archives, and that sort of thing. And before I left, we sent one portfolio of them to the National Gallery, which was a really fun way to see that people desired this work to be done and that it would continue to have a place among other samples. So now we're going to kind of shift into the professional studio days that I had at Dieu Donné. Tatiana, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say about kind of what the intention, of that.
Sure. Yeah, I think the idea behind the West Bayview Fellowship is to really immerse the person coming in all of our studio practices that we do in the studio working with artists, which of course, in your case, because of COVID, was possible in some intense ways, like with the L'Aquila, but also not as possible in a general way. There weren't as many people coming in and out, but also to support the fellow's own work and developing her own work in that they would get 4 days with a professional collaborator. So me or Amy would work to help the fellow do her studio days, just as any artist coming in would have kind of our knowledge and our sort of background, giving them as much help, and plus just an extra pair of hands in the studio, and all the things that you can do more easily or better when you have assistance on a professional level, so not just having somebody come in just for the afternoon, but talking out what we were going to do in advance. You prepped all the fibers really, and did a lot of testing, which I'm sure you'll talk about, but we together had these conversations, and I ended up working in the studio with you for both of the 2 days that you've already had. Katharine gets 4 days, but because of the pandemic, we decided to save 2 of those days until the summer, when hopefully everyone will be vaccinated and we could do a little more together. And Amy will do some days with you too. It just worked out that I did the first 2 days, but you'll have sort of access to, and you had access to both of us, and kind of bouncing ideas wise, and just kind of like what you were going to work on, what you're going to focus on. And I also have to say that Katharine is one of the most experienced people we've ever had in that kind of position. So for you, you really already knew how to do most of these techniques, but it was a matter of figuring out what you wanted to focus on and what you wanted to refine, and what you could get help from a collaborator that would be really useful. So of course you can do it all yourself, but still it's nice to have somebody else to help you in the space and to make things.
Yeah, exactly. And so what the slide that's on the screen now is from Elise Ferguson's paper Variables project. She came into the studio mapping out all of the different colors that she wanted to use to create her edition. And this was a project that Tatiana worked on, and I had the opportunity to work on as well. And so I kind of used my professional days to push the way I was approaching my own work to say, I'm not going to just use whatever pulps are in the studio, which is what I normally am tempted to do, but really try to sample out the way all of the colors are interacting with each other, firm up the yeses and nos about what was working and what I liked and what I didn't like, which was surprisingly difficult for me to really harness. And so that was a really good experience. Because while I knew how to do all of the fiber prep, I also knew maybe some of the shortcuts of why I didn't want to prep a certain fiber or that sort of thing. So I couldn't just blindly request something that was very difficult. So it was just kind of fun to see my little samples on the same cabinets that Elise's were on, since that was an influential project for me to be a part of, and we'll see with some of my other.
I just wanted to say also that I thought it was really interesting when we were working in the studio, how much we ended up referring back to these samples, and you tweaked things and really kind of used them. They really came in handy in a kind of also a sort of almost Albers color pattern, how these things play together, figuring out what base sheets and what colors worked on top of each other. You know, the same color doesn't look the same on white as it does on gray, and that we really use those a lot.
Yeah, and it also was really helpful for me to empathize in a different way with the artists that I have worked with and will continue to work with, in terms of needing to provide direction for the collaborator, meaning Tatiana was at the ready and was kind of like, what color's next? And I had to make that decision on the spot, which was difficult and also interesting. Kind of 3 distinct projects over our 2 days, which is about par for the course because my mind is often going several directions and I really like to try different things out. We talked a lot about how after doing my book work at Iowa that required a lot of planning and a lot of attention to how things were going to be working together in a binding structure and that sort of thing, how I could really just focus on the paper making. So I had some silk screens made that we used for pulp painting, which instead of using an ink like one would normally use for screen printing to push to apply color through the mesh, here we were using really finely beaten linen pulp that could actually be applied with a brush. And so I created these grounds or templates in sets of 4, sort of inspired by the Love Positive Women hearts, that then Tatiana and I went around basically to each station and just applied a wash of either a black or a white pigmented pulp. And so this is what they looked like wet. So they're halftone images, photographic images from some work that I had done previously. And so also it was interesting figuring out how to work together in a shared space with various precautions that we were trying to take that I think we did a good job figuring out, how to set up little stations and that sort of thing. So we weren't always on top of each other, because so much of collaborating is often leaning over the same thing, talking about it, etc. And this technique had first been introduced to me by Amy and Noel Anderson when they were working on an edition for his workspace residency. And so this was, again, an example of me thinking through a skill that I had learned for another artist's work and how maybe I could apply it to my own work. And that kind of became the parameters for deciding how to use my professional days. And it just so happened that Sarika took this great picture that exactly mirrors our summer 2018 screen printing afternoon. And I just want to briefly show this work. This was an artist's book that I did during my second year at Iowa. And you'll notice that the handkerchief forms that I was using are similar to the ones that were used for the pulp painting. So these were printed in a photographic halftone using photopolymer on a letterpress. And so it was really interesting to go and abstract my own work even farther, meaning how can I use this same image, but in a really distinctly different way. There's a broadside that I did to the left, and then to the right is another spread from the book with one of the handkerchiefs that was used for the silkscreen project. And so these are on the cloths when they were drying. So Tatiana also continued to encourage me to experiment with the different drying techniques.
Yeah, because you were really interested also in things that were almost flat, but not flat, and had a little bit of texture from, and a little more drape, kind of going back to your book work and some of those other things. And so you were drying things not under full restraint, but partially restrained and partially air dried.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I even ended up using a shaped decal that kind of fell apart. I had found it in a pile of Dieu Donné shaped decals, and it basically deteriorated throughout the process of making the paper because we didn't know whose project it was from. But it was interesting that I wanted to get away from the standard sizes of paper that I had been making. And so having these slightly more square proportions with the wild decals really became a fun, and the way that the silkscreen patterning kind of moved onto the deckled edge was really kind of a satisfying way of almost mimicking like a fraying fabric or something. And also, why thinking through what can I do with printmaking with paper pulp that's different from printmaking with a letterpress or something like that. So getting to have these varied backgrounds to the sheets and being surprised by what happened. I think we had a lot of fun in the studio with that, where we would kind of blurt out like, oh yeah, that one was really nice for whatever reason. So bringing that surprise factor back to my practice a little bit more was really rewarding. There's one of my piles that always accumulates wherever I go. And then shifting, I had been, part of the West Bay View Fellowship, the intention of immersing a recent graduate in the New York art scene, art world, being able to go, really see shows and that sort of thing. When the pandemic was a little bit better in quotes in the fall, I did make an effort to try to safely see what I could, and I ended up seeing a really inspiring show at MoMA called "Taking a Thread for a Walk," which is a quote from an Annie Albers essay, and I became obsessed with this gingham sampler of hers and fascinated by trying to basically reverse engineer how gingham worked. Because you see it everywhere, and then but when you look really closely at it, you realize how complex weaving can be. And I was also inspired by this textile that was a historical Japanese silk textile that I saw at the Met, and kind of how artists were working with distortion in textiles, meaning you kind of see these birds, but then you're seeing the pentagons and just kind of going between the two. And there, in this little vitrine there, you can kind of see towards the middle, there are these little sticks that can be used for practicing, figuring out how your weaving is going to work. So that sort of inspired me to really just play with lines. And so I was pulp painting on various base sheets, ranging from hemp to flax to abaca, to see what sorts of gingham I could make in handmade paper. And the painting on the pulp paint was interesting, but was lacking some of the dimension that happens with weaving. So Tatiana and I were talking about that a fair amount. I will also say that I often am working from my own personal archive of family photos. And this is one that I pull a lot of my color palettes from. This is me on my great grandmother, Nana Raymer's lap in Pennsylvania. And just, I was struck by the dish towel that's hanging on the back wall, which I was saying to Tatiana, I'd never noticed before until I started working on this project. So just this idea of revisiting things over and over again. And I've loved gingham since a very young age, as you can see with the photo on the left. And so playing around, it's a very good picture. And getting to see, you know, how do you create that mid-tone with the gingham, right? Because it's two stripes that are intersecting to create a third tone, which seems very simple, but is hard to do convincingly. So just challenging myself in those ways. I then kind of didn't know what to do with all of these gingham objects I had been making. So I tried embedding them in some 30 by 40 sheets of paper that I made by myself. Normally we would do them together, but wanting to keep some physical distance, Tatiana kind of showed me the ropes. And I'm about probably 5 inches taller than Tatiana. So I really said, okay, if Tatiana can do this, I have to do it. But was very tired after. But again, just taking time to I didn't know what this is going to be. I still don't know what it is. And just having the space to really live with these things in my studio has been really rewarding. This is a picture of Elise Ferguson's Paper Variables edition, which I talked about briefly before, which we worked with Mylar stenciling for, which is how I was making my gingham stripes, which Sarika, our studio manager, was a major help in getting all of those files cut on our new vinyl cutter. Elise had brought hers from another location, so it was really nice to be able to make my own on site at Dieu Donné. So you can see on the right, that is me applying the perpendicular white stripe to a blue stripe that Tatiana had made using a technique called a blowout, which we can talk a little bit about now, because this was sort of what I needed the most technical guidance on. I think that we worked really closely about all of the tips and tricks about getting a successful blowout.
Yeah, and I think that came out of our conversations of how to get you just that little bit of texture or a little bit of kind of physicality that some of the woven materials that you'd been working with had. And so I think when we were talking about that and you were working with the pulp paints and saying, you know, you liked them, but you wanted something a little bit to happen, I thought back to some of the work that Dieu Donné has done over time with Mel Edwards and people like that, where a cotton blowout is done on top of a sheet of abaca or something else, and then they slightly shrink against each other. So for those of you who don't know, a blowout is made by making a sheet of paper, which you can see is a gray sheet below on the mold there. I'm holding a Mylar stencil that I'm about to put down. Then the stencil is laid down on top of that short cotton. And then everywhere that the stencil is, the sheet is going to be protected. And everywhere that there's an opening, we are going to use water pressure and blow out or physically remove, using the water pressure, all of the pulp from that area. So we can kind of control how cleanly we do that, or how atmospheric we leave it, depending on how much we actually blow it out. So these were definitely quite challenging, and we did them up to 22 by 30 inches because they, are straight lines and they really do show sort of everything. If you're doing a sort of biomorphic image, you might not really have quite as much detail that, everybody notices if it's not quite done. But actually it was kind of interesting because I think Katharine, going with like some of what you were doing already with the screens and the backgrounds and stuff, we ended up kind of liking it sometimes when it wasn't completely blown out.
Yeah, and noticing the way that the pigments would migrate off of the fibers as Tatiana would blow them out more heavily, meaning they would kind of feather from a pale gray tone to a white, which resonated with some of my other work. So playing around with the softness of these geometric lines, and even just laying down the stencil as it got to the 22 by 30 size, they would kind of torque the stripes. So it would be kind of like trying to lay down fringe flat on a wet sheet of paper. So that was really interesting too, to just really have to stick with it in those ways, and feel supported by Tatiana saying like, yes, we can do this, where I think perhaps it would have either taken me a lot longer to do it by myself, or I just might have gotten discouraged, not knowing if it was even possible. So knowing that it was, I think I did say to Tatiana at some point, like, if you think this is possible, that's all I need to know to kind of keep trying to pursue it. And so you can see here, Tatiana is getting ready to couch or remove from the mold a blown out sheet of paper. And these, we didn't really come in, we knew we were going to be playing around with the blowouts, but we ended up making several of these pieces that were sort of atmospheric pulp painting in the background. This is a bit of a, this happened last time too, which is funny. So we had been playing around with the geometries and the abstraction and background and foreground. And this is a picture from 2013, my junior year of college, where I had been taught by Tatiana at Mount Holyoke, working with some soft ground etchings of Gee's Bend quilts that were published by Crown Point Press. So this is the atmospheric pulp painting element that I was talking about, where I was sort of masking out certain areas and applying washes of color, because we had looked at the Albers work together and kind of discussed that it wasn't such a harsh contrast of color. It was a little bit more subtle. And that's what made the gingham interesting, because you couldn't quite tell when it was going to shift. And then here is an example of putting the blowout down on top of it. So kind of then masking those areas that I had pulp painted. And I would also say that I have always been inspired by Mary Temple's work, who did a series of blowouts at Dieu Donné of window scenes. So thinking of those window panes, these even reminded me of blinds in an apartment. that I lived in, and just, again, being surprised by not quite knowing where something was going, but having the support to pursue that. And then my kind of final touch was adding back some of that cheesecloth that I had brought with me from Iowa and had been using to print from, to add some texture to these sheets to kind of reference that warp and weft, and bring some more texture to these sheets. And Tatiana's description of, I like things that are almost flat, not quite flat, just curvy enough that you notice they aren't flat. And so this was pressed into the sheet and then removed to create a really subtle texture. And Willa, Tatiana, and I were talking about, these pieces are dry, but it is to be determined if they are finished yet. I have some curiosity surrounding maybe working with some dried pigment or charcoal or graphite to kind of see if there are certain sections in which I can really heighten the texture of the sheet. And that was another reason we kind of decided to spread out my professional days, because I work best when given that time to kind of really live with things in my environment. And so here's just kind of in conclusion, a picture of me finishing up in the studio for my studio days. We ended up making, I think, 6 of these 22 by 30s, which the blowouts themselves took upwards of between 20 and 30 minutes of Tatiana standing there with the hose. So that was definitely something that it would have been a lot less if I had to do it just by myself. So yeah, big thank you to everybody for coming, and that's what I have for you.
Thank you, Katharine and Tatiana. Ooh, Tatiana is muted.
Oh,
There we
sorry. There.
So there are a couple questions. Tim asks, when working with visiting artists new to paper as a medium, what do they find most engaging or exciting about making works in paper?
So that's a really good question, and something that worked really, Lakila, having worked primarily in plaster casting before, she was saying that oftentimes she would, work on figuring out what these compositions would look like, meaning how she would arrange the earrings. And then kind of like you pour the plaster and you go, like you really have to just commit to putting them in there, letting them dry. You don't really know how it's going to look until the plaster's dried. And so she really responded to the immediacy of paper making. In the course of that weekend, we made over 40 sheets, 40 pieces, not even just sheets of paper, 40 pieces. And I would kind of hear her across the studio be like, oops, dropped an earring, pick up her eyedropper, fix the sheet, and carry on. So in an afternoon, she could try out 10 to 15 different compositions in a kind of low stakes, high reward way. And also now the paper pieces are much easier for her to, she was even saying, oh, I could tear some of these up. I could work in collage with these. So adding some generative flexibility to her process, I thought was really cool to see that she was excited about that.
Tatiana, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think each artist that we've worked with always finds different things, but I think a lot of people do respond to sort of the forgiving nature of paper in a weird way, especially for people who are very entrenched in their practice, whatever they do, their normal methods of working. It can be kind of liberating to work in paper because, yes, you can mess up something and you can't fix it, but a lot of things you can kind of work with it and then just keep working with it. And if it's not working, kind of rework it or fix things, because it's all wet and it's all sort of possible. And you don't have this thing where you're working against drying time, which a lot of people who are painters are, sort of balancing, or sculptors working in plaster like Aquila. So there's a lot of things like that I think people find. I definitely have heard many artists, kind of coming in with this anxiety, and then after an hour or two, they're like, "Oh, you can do anything with this material, and it's all still possible. It's not like closed off. It will let you keep working on it." So that's definitely, I think, a thing that a lot of people get excited about.
Catherine, another question for you. Elizabeth says, I would love to hear a little bit more about your process with pulp paint and a silkscreen stencil. I can see you use the mesh without a frame. Did you use a specific mesh count or multiple kinds of mesh?
It was one mesh count, the number of which I'm forgetting off the top of my head.
We usually use between like 80 and 90 mesh count,
And-
works really well, but we can go up to 110, but definitely on the coarser side is a little easier. And I think for yours, I think it was about 80.
Yeah, and that for my images worked really well. We had looked, again, kind of calling back to being in a place like Dieu Donné, I could say, what did Noel use for his images? How do my images compare to that? And I think Noel was using 110, which is
Finer.
yeah, a finer, can be used for textiles and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, they were just cut off of the screen. And then it was all exposed on a singular screen that was then cut into 4 bits, and we would just spray them out in between, lay them down flat. It's a really pleasurable sort of tactile experience, even in some ways more so for me than working with the Mylar stencils, because the Mylar can feel so sharp. Where these screens were just kind of like laying something down, smoothing a brush over it, and then you have a beautiful image. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to experiment with that.
Yeah, and I think having the right consistency of pulp paint was the key thing, right? Because the thing that sort of clogs that process is if the screen gets clogged, if the pulp's not fine enough, right? And then it's not fun.
No, then it's upsetting.
Yes, but otherwise it's really nice when it works well, which these did, and we could make a lot of them very quickly, and that it's very satisfying, immediate kind of feeling of what does this look like, and then you really could kind of alter what you did on the next one if you wanted to, because you'd see immediately what was working that you were interested in.
And then one more question from Tim. This will be the last question. How do you balance your attention to making your own art and collaborating within your own art practice to collaborating with visiting artists and making art with them?
Well, and this was something that I had thought a lot about at the University of Iowa, especially because I was so interested in Dieu Donné. I had started at Dieu Donné in 2014 as an intern. And so it was working collaboratively is very integral to my complete understanding of papermaking as a medium. And so I was always sort of interested in learning techniques to apply them to other people's work, and becoming skillful and masterful in those to help facilitate other people's projects. But what can become very difficult is that then where is your time to dedicate to your own work? And in my thesis work at Iowa, I was making an argument of sorts that to be a collaborator, you also have to be an artist and maintain your own artistic practice to be able to not only empathize with the artist and the kind of difficult decisions that have to be made, the vulnerability that happens in the studio, because as a collaborator, you're kind of being invited into somebody's vulnerable personal expression in this really delicate way. And that is something that, what was most interesting to me about this fellowship was being the artist myself who was now working with a collaborator. I could talk all day long about how I think one should be a good collaborator, but it was really interesting being the art, and also just the pressure of like, I want to help you make this work, that it feels great and it feels really exciting, but also feels a little bit higher risk that other people's time is invested in this and kind of is seeing everything out there. So working between the two, and making sure to just continue to reflect on my own work as an artist to kind of become a better collaborator and vice versa. And Tatiana's done a lot more collaborating than I have, so I'm sure she might have something to add there.
Well, I think you did a very good job answering that question. And I think your sense for collaboration has always been something you've been interested in and has sort of developed over time. I mean, we've talked about that from many years, right? But it is always hard to balance, like being really attentive to somebody else's work and then also kind of diving into your own. But I think that you kind of do need both to really be able to help people. You do need to have that vulnerability yourself and to see, and then you showed several examples of other artists' work that influenced you in terms, not necessarily of imagery, but of ways of working. And that is something that I think we can really get from collaboration. Oftentimes in the studio, I see somebody working in a way that just would never occur to me. But it can be really helpful to sort of have those ideas in the back of your mind when you're working on your own work for how to approach something, whether it's the sampling or grids or, pre-studio time, like preparation wise, like you showed with Elise's work, or whether it's, something like the silk screen technique that Noel was using for very different work. But technically, kind of having a crossover there, or even something like the LPW hearts, that's just really production, and seeing how that can be very freeing and helpful also. So I think, all of those things we kind of need to kind of get refreshed occasionally, right? Otherwise we get into our little ways of working. And it's been very fun for me to work with you. I mean, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but Katharine was my student so many years ago. And, my students have gone on all over the place and done different things, but there's a few special ones like you. And, I've done really a lot with the medium that I work in the most. And it's really nice to see the work that you have developed and also really feel like colleagues in the studio, which is great. And to be able to help you make your work is really a pleasure. So we're excited for your other 2 professional days, and also for your new current life at Carriage House, where you are now. So you could say something about that just to end a little bit.
Yeah, so I am sitting at Carriage House Paper in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So just a stone's throw from the Navy Yard, where Willa is, where just next week I will be starting a position as studio manager and art director at Carriage House. So we are very excited. And I have one of the founders, Donna, in the space with me too, which is very exciting. She can give a little socially distanced wave. So that's really great. I feel it's been a really long-term goal of mine to end up in New York making handmade paper, and I didn't really know how it was going to happen, but I did kind of say to myself, as soon as I graduated college, that wherever I end up, there will be presses and there will be good people. And so I feel like that's held true and maybe a good closing note.
That's a perfect closing note. Thank you so much, Catherine. I know that Dieu Donné is going to miss you a lot, but we're all very excited for your carriage house next chapter and to continue talking with you and sharing paper making stories. Thank you also, Tatiana. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you to everyone who's joining today. We'll all talk more soon. Thank you so much.